Before we get into this video, I'm going to start by saying that there will be spoilers for the Age of Calamity demo, so if you haven't played it yet, or you're avoiding playing it until the full game releases, then consider returning to this video once you've experienced the demo, or after you've played the full release game. Also, I will try to make this as coherent as possible, I promise. It may come out making some kind of sense, or it'll just be a confusing mass of words. Hopefully the former. Apologies in advance if I'm making this too convoluted to follow. Also, I realise that it's a day early, but I wanted to say a happy Halloween to everyone all around the world. I hope you have a great day. So, time travel. Here we go again. Okay, so maybe we're just jumping the gun here and making assumptions that are blown way out of proportion, but I mean, come on, time travel again? I will make clear that despite what I'll be saying in this video, I am a massive Zelda fan, and I never minded too much the whole timeline thing in the past, but once Breath of the Wild was confirmed to be the merging of all the timelines, I breathed such a sigh of relief and felt a wave of excitement for the simplifying of the whole franchise going forward. But I mean, now that's just up in the air, isn't it? So, for those of you that have played the new demo of Age of Calamity, or you don't mind spoilers, you will of course know that I'm referring to the opening cutscene that shows us the events of the calamity that led to the destruction of Hyrule, the death of King Rome, and the death of the four champions, and the almost death of Link before being saved by Zelda, unlocking her sacred power at the very last moment. What we see is that at the exact same time as her power is being used, a bright light emanates from her study and the mini Egg Guardian is awoken, before heading to the window and gazing out into the chaos. We see Zelda declare that she must protect everyone, and then we cut back to who I will now refer to as Eggy, just out of nowhere activates a portal surrounded by Sheikah text, which has already been translated to read Gate of Time Open, or Open Gate of Time. I've seen both ways being described as the translation. Before, he's attacked by a normal, larger Guardian and escapes by jumping into this portal, but he is also followed through the time portal by strands of malice. Let's try to visualize this so we can track what happens and what could be happening. Eggy ends up back in time at a point before the calamity, most likely with the intention of stopping the coming calamity. How exactly he aims to do that is unknown to us until the full game releases, and the initial impression is that he's simply in the past of the same Breath of the Wild era timeline that we already know and have experienced, confirmed to be a single timeline by Nintendo at the end of all separate timelines in the Zelda franchise. However, now I just can't help but shake the feeling that it's not as simple as moving back in time in a singular direction, despite how much I hope that's the case. Instead, what I think happens is that Eggy travelling back and bringing with him strands of malice, along with other details shown in this game, are in fact anomalies in the timeline, and have taken a sidestep into a parallel what-if timeline. The reason I suspect it is not the same past as the Breath of the Wild timeline is because Age of Calamity already seemingly has some contradictions to pieces of lore, such as the Sheikah Towers, the Sheikah Slate and its runes, and the corrupted Guardians appearing before the calamity begins. Up until this point, I put these down to nothing more than just discrepancies in gameplay to give the players more tools to use and familiar enemies to fight, and not being too integrated into the story, but rather just gameplay features. But that's not the case. Also in the demo, it is implied that the reason they have access to the Sheikah Slate runes such as Magnesis and the bombs is directly because of Eggy giving them the ability to use these runes, and for each of the characters to be able to use the Sheikah Slate at a point in time before they were meant to be able to, as well as discover the existence of the runes, which creates a paradox in time in which these characters were made aware of the features of the Sheikah Slate before they should have. It would also seem that the strands of malice that travelled back with Eggy and infecting Guardians is actually integrated as a part of the plot, whereas in Breath of the Wild we are told that this was a complete surprise when Ganon struck, and they were blindsided by this unforeseeable turn of events. They also happen to come across some visual data on the Sheikah slate, which directly shows the characters what looks like photographs and snapshots of the Calamity mass destruction of Hyrule. And in the photos, you can see that the Guardians have been corrupted. But now, in Age of Calamity, it's revealed to us that they've been completely exposed to the corruption of the Guardians before they should have. And maybe they don't realise that it's Malice or Ganon exactly, especially when in the demo some of the Guardians get corrupted. Maybe they don't realise this is something that Ganon can do, but the sheer fact that they've witnessed, for a start, how the Guardians can be turned against them, and also the photographic evidence on the Sheikah slate from Eggy, should really have raised some red flags and given them time to figure out either a way to prevent that from happening or to be prepared for it, because they now have the advantage of knowing what Ganon's plan is. This alone should just be some evidence enough that this past has drastically been altered. Also, we see the emergence of a Sheikah Tower, even though these shouldn't have been raised until after the 100 years following the Calamity, when Link awakens and activates the Great Plateau Tower, which in turn activates and raises all of the others. Up until that point, the only Sheikah Tower that had been noticed by anyone was the Great Plateau Tower, and that was simply just revealed slightly when the Calamity occurred. No other tower was completely raised. So just these reasons alone make me think that Age of Calamity is now in a separate, mirrored universe alongside the history of the original timeline, as opposed to being a part of that original timeline. Another reason I think this is because of the events that transpired in Age of Calamity are a part of the Breath of the Wild timeline. Then when we played that game and Link reawakens to the world, there would have been mention from someone like King Rome about those events, or the towers would have been raised when he woke up, or hell, even Impa or Purah would have said something like, "Oh, that little guardian tried to warn us and help us, but alas, it did not work." And Purah wouldn't have written in her diary or told us that she discovered the runes years after the Calamity. She instead would have said something like, "Oh hey, that little guardian showed us what the Sheikah slate could do." With these points in mind, it just makes sense to believe we could be looking at an alternate timeline where the information the characters have around the time of Breath of the Wild would be different than the version that we experienced. Personally, I would just feel like it severely undercuts the impact of the story in Breath of the Wild if they in any way try to alter the events into something different, and I sincerely hope they don't try to alter the fates of the champions in any way. I mean, yeah, it's sad that they died, but that's sort of part of the tragedy and the beauty almost in Breath of the Wild story, the tale of those characters. But if they suddenly alter time so that they survive, maybe, and in a spin-off game no less, it just almost feels quite insulting if that's how the course of events go. And I mean, of course, it's all speculation on my part, but right now, with the revelation of time travel, it could very well be that this is what happens in the game. So, at this stage, we don't know how Eggy could possibly alter the events. Maybe that's something that we'll see in the full game, and maybe we'll have answers as to exactly what this time travel aspect means in the bigger scope of Breath of the Wild's story. So, let's take a look at some possible scenarios of what could be happening due to this whole time travel thing. So, scenario 1. The Breath of the Wild era, from 10,000 years previous, right the way up until the defeat of the Calamity at the end of the game, all takes place in one singular timeline. During the Calamity, right at the point where Zelda uses her power to save Link from the Guardians, Eggy travels back in time to try and prevent all of this taking place. It travels back to the events of Age of Calamity, but it ultimately fails, resulting in the 100 years and Link's reawakening, as we already know, the now included history of Eggy being present at the time of the Calamity, potentially looping in a cycle in which this singular timeline's Eggy repeatedly travels back in time to fail, and each time letting the events play out as we already know them. Unfortunately, I don't think this version is possible due to the lack of knowledge of any of Eggy's involvement during the events of Breath of the Wild as we've already experienced. Scenario 2. Exactly the same as Scenario 1, however, the point at which Eggy travels back creates an alternate timeline in the past that sidesteps away into a new reality where Eggy and the malice that travels back have an effect on the events and game that we see and play in Breath of the Wild, but instead alter an entirely different future in a different timeline that we may not even get to experience. In this timeline, we could see Calamity Ganon destroyed by Zelda and Link and the Four Champions during Age of Calamity's time, instead of failing, and this game gives us an alternate happy ending and could be considered as a fun, non-canon what-if scenario, or it is a canon separate timeline parallel to the first, where either they do defeat Calamity Ganon and that's just how that whole story ends, or they still fail and we move into Breath of the Wild, but the events and the knowledge of the characters in that timeline's Breath of the Wild would be vastly different from the original timeline's Breath of the Wild. See, this concept for storytelling always causes issues, and only ever in a few instances does it work out quite well. Mostly, it just introduces way too many problems and questions and possibilities, and for me, the idea of resolving everything with time travel, it's become such an overused vehicle for storytelling, and it's just an easy way out of writing anything truly creative and original, because you can just erase everything and alter anything by saying, well, time travel. It's just such a cop-out in my opinion, but I mean, here we are with the reality that time travel is now officially making a return within Zelda, and not only that, but it plays a role in the events of the Breath of the Wild era. And it doesn't stop there. This was pretty much where this video was going to end, but unfortunately, the issues that could arise from time travel being introduced doesn't just end with Age of Calamity anymore, but could be a part of Breath of the Wild's upcoming sequel. I had a theory, which I was going to make a video about once upon a time, but I decided not to because of how unlikely it seemed at the time. But now I kind of worry that that's what might actually happen, or at the very least has the potential to happen. And if people think it's still very unlikely, had I spoke about that theory previously, which many other Zelda theorists have, it's generally just been shrugged off as there's no real evidence to support that it could happen. But now with Age of Calamity, if that turns out to be canon, has given us time travel, again, until we play Breath of the Wild 2, there is no way that we can dismiss this theory as a possibility. So as I said previously, this isn't a theory that only I have come up with and talked about. Many others have also spoke about this kind of thing, so I'm not claiming to be the first and only person to raise it, but based on what we now know, I'm just going to talk about it and just raise a couple of possibilities that could in fact happen. So, shortly after Breath of the Wild's sequel trailer released, I was replaying the whole thing in my mind and wondering, well, what if we're seeing another case of time travel? In the trailer, we notice that there's a lack of the Sheikah Slate, as well as the Sheikah Towers, and the Guardian containment pillars that surround Hyrule Castle. And maybe it's as simple as they decided to bury them all again, but I can't help but think that Zelda's fascination with the technology and her insistence on studying them, and even the investigation into the divine beasts after Breath of the Wild ends, would just prevent her from burying them all again, and instead wanting to continue the research, at least for a while longer. But these are absent from the trailer, and it's raised the question ever since we saw it, where are they? Well, what if Breath of the Wild 2 isn't a sequel in terms of time passing within the game world itself? Story-wise, it's a sequel, but what if the events are a kind of alternate prequel? Or in fact, the actual prequel to the entire plot itself, not Age of Calamity? Okay, so for the rest of this video, let's hypothesize that Zelda and Link in the sequel, now armed with the knowledge of time travel in either of the two possible timelines, whether that's the original single timeline, or the potential sideways timeline created by Eggy travelling back, decide that they're going to try to prevent the calamity from happening altogether. At one stage, I even considered the possibility that the princess and hero from the Tapestry legend are actually this Zelda and Link themselves, and the legend they hear of in Breath of the Wild's era is actually them hearing the tale of themselves, unbeknownst to them, creating a time loop where they created the legend themselves in the past to hear it in the future and travel back to unknowingly create it. It could potentially explain the hero on the tapestry having a greenish hand, along with Link being imbued with this green energy in the trailer, signifying these two are one and the same. Now, this could be the case, but I thought that maybe they couldn't travel back 10,000 years because the trailer shows Hyrule Castle as it is in Breath of the Wild, and I seriously doubt the castle has stood in the same state and spot for that length of time. But then again, the shot of the castle might have nothing to do with being in the past, and could just be a shot from the present before they travel back. So we shouldn't rule out the possibility of them travelling back to the start. The other issue with this theory is that the legend speaks of Sheikah, and also the calamity in a similar fashion to how it exists in the present time. So if they did travel back to fight the calamity and ultimately be responsible for creating this legend, we wouldn't be seeing Ganondorf's corpse, and all we'd get is Breath of the Wild's exact same plot again, just 10,000 years ago, as they would need the Divine Beasts, 4 champions to pilot those beasts, and all the Guardians. So, I mean, it would just be the exact same thing, except the malice corrupting the Sheikah, so I don't think this will be the case. So really, the current scenario that I'm theorizing is that because of Eggy revealing the possibility of time travel, Link and Zelda travel back to a point before the calamity and even before the Sheikah is excavated or even heard of, and try to prevent the calamity from happening and end up discovering Ganondorf's remains. The malice that we see pouring from his corpse is the malice that would become the calamity, but this is altered by the arrival of Zelda and Link, and instead he is broken from his containment and awakens. This could result in 2 possible outcomes going forward. 1. Zelda and Link prevent the calamity from ever taking place and save Hyrule, them two being the only ones who are aware of whatever happened, and the timeline of events of the Zelda franchise in its entirety play out as follows. All of the previous games and timelines take place, the split timelines converge into the Breath of the Wild era, the calamity happens, Breath of the Wild plays out and into the sequel, Link and Zelda time travel back in a single timeline and alter the future, which eliminates that future from the singular timeline and continues playing out in one single timeline, just with a different future. 2. Exactly the same as scenario 1, but the moment Zelda and Link travel back to stop the calamity and are successful, they cause yet another timeline split, with this new timeline being the one where the calamity is stopped and the original singular timeline of Breath of the Wild still exists with the history and story of the calamity happening. And that's just going off the idea that there is indeed time travel in Breath of the Wild 2, which if there was, and also time travel in Age of Calamity, we could potentially be looking at 3 timeline splits, each with their own possible alternate timeline splits, depending on if they fail or succeed to stop the calamity during Age of Calamity, or if they fail and reach the sequel point and decide to travel back, and maybe they succeed in the past and it affects the future, or they fail in the past and it branches off yet again and again and again. Now let's say there's absolutely no time travel in Breath of the Wild 2, or anything that affects the present day calamity and the plot of the sequel. The sheer fact that Eggy time travels already opens up the possibility of at least one alternate timeline existing in parallel to the original singular timeline that exists at the end of all other timelines. Whether that side timeline results in the prevention of the calamity or not remains to be seen, but we can now assume there is at least one other timeline somewhere. The only way I could see this not becoming a huge issue is if Nintendo went down the route of introducing time travel, but without it splitting timelines into alternate sideways realities and timelines, having Eggy only moving back in time but not creating a side path in time. So even if it went back in time and tried to alter something, it ultimately fails, which keeps the future the same. Or any effects it has on the past have minor effects on the future and don't actually change the future instead of forming an entirely new future and a whole separate timeline. Do you see where this starts to become a problem? The possibilities just become endless as to what may or may not, or could and could not happen. When this type of concept gets introduced, it just becomes open season on any possible outcome and becomes a giant mess of ideas. For example, we could end up with the following. Let's say Zelda and Link did travel back in time in the original timeline to try and stop the calamity and are successful. We get a timeline where the calamity doesn't happen and the world doesn't remember it except for Zelda and Link if they decide to return to the future of this original timeline. If they don't return to this point in time, we have the Ocarina of Time scenario again, where there's a timeline where a calamity happens and Zelda and Link vanish from time and never return, resulting in a Hyrule at the aftermath of the calamity, and a timeline in the past where they prevent the calamity and live into a future that's unknown. Alternatively, they travel back to stop the calamity and fail. We end up with a timeline where the calamity happens anyway, except Zelda and Link either travel back to the future and call it a lost cause, or they die in the past, unable to prevent the calamity that happens 10,000 years ago, and once again alters time both in the past and potentially in the future. Yeah, this could just keep going on, so maybe I'll leave it there. As far as Age of Calamity goes, I honestly think it's a sideways timeline split, with Eggy showing up in a time when it shouldn't have, and becomes an anomaly that causes things like the Sheikah Towers to activate when they shouldn't, as well as the Sheikah Slate runes being active at this point in time too. I mean, this game could very well just be its own open and closed, self-contained story that really shouldn't be considered canon to the Breath of the Wild story that we've experienced, and instead we're just meant to view it as its own alternate take on the events that lead up to the calamity. I really wanted this game to be canon, but I find myself kind of hoping it's just a pure spin-off with no bearing on the official canon of the franchise, much like the first Hyrule Warriors game. So whichever way it plays out, I'm sure it's going to be a great game based on the initial impressions from the demo, and I'm sure it's going to have an epic story that we'll all enjoy. All I can hope is that this time travel aspect is just a single timeline loop where Eggy goes back and attempts to stop the calamity, but fails, and Breath of the Wild as we know it plays out, and we just see the characters not mention Eggy for some reason, most likely due to, a retcon from when Nintendo first wrote the story, sort of compared to the new story ideas they have now. And it's just one of those things that, Nintendo will, ask our forgiveness for, and we just have to put that to one side and just accept that it is what it is. So those are my thoughts that have been on my mind since this demo released and gave us the tired old time travel trope. But let me know what you think about this time travel aspect, and if you're all for it or against it, and what you think of the potential return to multiple timelines. At this stage, it seems almost undeniable that we're definitely getting at least a timeline split, and I don't think that we can even deny the idea of having multiple timeline splits, because once the option for time travel becomes part of the lore and the canon, and you start looking at timelines diverging left, right, backwards, forwards, you can pick any possible scenario and theorize that it could very well happen. And, up until some point in the future where we don't see that happen, at this stage, anything is possible. So I hope that wasn't too painful to listen to. I can just imagine people screaming at the monitor now. that I have made that sound way more convoluted than it needs to, or it just doesn't make any sense at all. If it doesn't, I apologize. It's really one of those things that sort of made some kind of sense in my head thinking about it, but this is just the thing with time travel for me, is that as soon as it becomes a plot point, my mind will just race trying to think of all of the different possible scenarios. But yeah, hopefully it wasn't too difficult to listen to. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me. And just be sure to hit the like and subscribe button. I have tons more videos up and coming in the next few weeks. And if you haven't already noticed, I've been working on a Majora's Mask poster, and that's been playing in the background of this video. I'll have that posted on my Twitter and my ArtStation, which will both be linked in the description below if you'd like to go and check those out. But let me know what you think, and if you think the artwork looks pretty cool, and if you like the video. So again, happy Halloween everyone, thank you for checking out the video, stay safe, and I'll see you all next time.